I'm Pierce. What's the problem?
You're my problem. I think I love you.
There was a time when half the country stopped what it was doing on a Tuesday night to watch a TV show about army surgeons cracking jokes in Korea. That show ran for 11 years, ended with the most watched broadcast in American television history, and then, slowly, quietly, began to fade from the cultural conversation that once treated it as one of the most important things on television. The record it set in 1983 still stands. The show itself has never been more than a streaming click away. And yet, for most people under 40, it might as well not exist. This is MASH, 1972. How the iconic TV classic was slowly forgotten.
Hold on. Oh, lay off, Frank. I just had a hard day at the office. Your conduct in there was not only unbecoming...
Where it started. On September 17th, 1972, CBS aired the first episode of MASH. The show was based on Robert Altman's 1970 film, which was itself adapted from Richard Hooker's 1968 novel, Hooker being the pen name of Dr. H. Richard Hornberger, a surgeon who had actually served in a MASH unit during the Korean War. He had spent 12 years writing the novel and another 5 finding a publisher. When he finally sold the television rights, he accepted a flat fee of $500 per episode, a deal that, in retrospect, aged about as well as Donald Sutherland's flat fee from Animal House. It was set during the Korean War of the early 1950s, but the United States was still fighting in Vietnam when it premiered, and everyone watching knew it. The setup was simple enough on paper: a mobile army surgical hospital in Uijeongbu, South Korea. A team of doctors, nurses, and support staff dealing with the wounded while trying to maintain their sanity. But the execution was something that American television had barely seen before. It was funny, it was dark, it was sometimes devastating. It refused to behave like a sitcom. The original cast was built around Alan Alda as Captain Benjamin Hawkeye Pierce, the brilliant, wisecracking surgeon who couldn't stomach the war he was trapped in. Wayne Rogers played his best friend Trapper, John McIntyre. McLean Stevenson played their genial, incompetent commanding officer, Colonel Henry Blake. Loretta Swit was Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan, the head nurse. Larry Linville played the straight-laced, infuriating Major Frank Burns. Gary Berghoff played the show's moral center, Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the company clerk who somehow knew what was needed before anyone asked. And Jamie Farr played Maxwell Klinger, the soldier from Toledo, Ohio, who spent the first several seasons trying to get a psychiatric discharge by showing up to everything in women's clothing. What nobody told that first audience was that the show nearly didn't make it past its first season. The ratings were poor enough that CBS seriously considered canceling it. The network made a crucial decision instead. They moved the show to a better time slot in season 2, placing it right after the enormously popular All in the Family. The show immediately jumped into the top 10. It never left the top 20 again for the rest of its run.
Tell him where it hurts, Frank. Don't be brave.
Oh, why don't you go boil some water or something?
The show that changed television. For most of the 1970s, MASH was not just a hit, it was an event. It was the kind of show people talked about at work the next morning, the kind that shaped how viewers thought about what television could be. What made it genuinely different was the way it mixed tones that most shows never tried to put in the same room together. An episode could make you laugh for 20 minutes and then hit you with something that didn't feel like a joke at all. The operating room scenes were played straight, without a laugh track, an unusual choice for a primetime comedy in 1972. When surgeons were working on someone who might not make it, there was no cue telling the audience how to feel. They figured it out themselves. The research that went into the show was real and sustained. Producers conducted interviews with actual MASH surgeons who had served during the Korean War, using their experiences as source material for storylines. Korean War veterans regularly contacted the production team with stories from their service, only to be told the idea had already been used. The writers incorporated real historical context, the McCarthy era, major sporting events, the cultural presence of Marilyn Monroe, into episodes throughout the run. This wasn't a show dressed in period costumes. It was trying to reconstruct a specific moment in American life. The show also did something almost no American network program had attempted before. It killed a major character, not wrote them off, not transferred them out, killed them. At the end of season 3, Colonel Henry Blake was written out of the show, not by retirement or a convenient transfer, but by death. Actor McLean Stevenson had decided to leave, frustrated by what he felt was a secondary role behind Alda's dominant Hawkeye. The writers saw the departure as an opportunity to remind the audience what kind of show this actually was. The script for Abyssinia, Henry, was distributed to the cast without its final page. They filmed every scene believing the episode would end with Blake's earned discharge and his flight home. Then, moments before filming the final scene, the last page was handed out. Radar walks into the operating room mid-surgery and reads from a teletype. Colonel Blake's plane was shot down over the Sea of Japan. There were no survivors. The final scene was filmed in 2 takes. The cast's reaction is one of the most genuinely raw moments in the history of American television, not because actors performed grief, but because they experienced it in real time, because they had not been told. What the cameras caught was not performance. It was the actual shock of people hearing something they did not expect. CBS was inundated with viewer complaint letters after it aired. Nobody cared. The episode had proven that MASH was willing to go where other shows wouldn't.
Don't mind. I'm no kid anymore, you know. I've been around.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Globe.
The cast that kept changing. One of the things that made MASH unusual for its era was how much it changed and how it survived those changes. By the time the show ended in 1983, only 2 characters from the original cast remained. Hawkeye, played by Alan Alda in every single one of the show's 256 episodes, and Margaret Houlihan, played by Loretta Swit across all 11 seasons. Alda was also the only person in television history to win Emmy Awards for acting, writing, and directing for the same show. Wayne Rogers, who played Trapper John, quietly quit after season 3 due to dissatisfaction with how his character was developing. He simply did not return when shooting resumed. His replacement was Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt, a character who had a completely different relationship with Hawkeye, warmer and less anarchic, that gradually shifted the emotional center of the show. Where Trapper had been Hawkeye's partner in chaos, B.J. was his conscience. It made for a quieter dynamic and a different kind of show. McLean Stevenson's Colonel Blake was replaced by Harry Morgan as Colonel Sherman Potter, a career military man, far more grounded, who brought a different kind of authority to the 4077th. Morgan had actually appeared in an earlier episode of MASH playing a completely different character, a hysterical general named Bartford Hamilton Steele, before being cast as Potter. That earlier role didn't stop anyone from bringing him back in a completely different capacity, which says something about how much the producers trusted both the audience and the actor. Larry Linville's Frank Burns, the show's primary comic villain in its early years, was replaced in season 6 by David Ogden Stiers as Charles Emerson Winchester III, a character who was pompous in a more sophisticated, less cartoonish way, and who occasionally earned the audience's genuine sympathy. Linville had left because he felt the character had nowhere further to go. He was probably right. Frank Burns worked best as a simple foil. Winchester was a genuine creation. Linville and Alda remained close friends after the show ended. At Linville's funeral, Alda delivered the eulogy, and at Linville's own specific request, closed it with the line, "Worms now eat Frank Burns." Gary Berghoff left the show in season 8, making Radar's farewell one of the most emotionally affecting departures in the series. His final scene, leaving camp in his Jeep, waving, smaller and smaller in the distance, is the kind of television moment that people who saw it remember decades later. Creator Larry Gelbart himself had left after season 4, worn down by the demands of producing one of the most popular shows on television. Each departure changed the show's character. The early seasons had a looser, more anarchic energy, Hawkeye and Trapper pulling pranks, Frank Burns being outraged, the camp behaving like a very dark comedy. The later seasons became more serious, more overtly dramatic, more invested in the psychology of its characters under sustained pressure. Harry Morgan himself admitted in interviews that he felt the cracks were starting to show by season 9. Both versions of the show had their defenders, but they were, in many ways, two different shows sharing the same name and the same hills outside Malibu.
All right, listen up. We operate on the ones that can't wait.
The finale that stopped the country. On February 28, 1983, MASH ended with a 2.5-hour finale titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. Alan Alda directed it and co-wrote it. CBS had resisted ending the show. Alda had wanted to stop after season 10 and was persuaded to do a shortened 11th season and the finale film instead. The network's reluctance to let it go was entirely understandable. Rational, even. But the show had simply run out of Korean war doctors willing to share stories the writers hadn't already used. The decision to end it was correct. The viewing figures were, and remain, staggering. Approximately 106 million Americans watched the finale when it aired. Roughly 77% of all televisions in use that night were tuned to CBS. It was the most watched broadcast in American television history at the time, a record it held until 2010, when it was finally surpassed by Super Bowl 44. It remains to this day the most watched scripted episode of television ever broadcast. No drama, no comedy, no prestige cable production has come anywhere near it. What those 106 million people watched was not a celebratory send-off. The finale was bleak in places. Hawkeye suffering a psychological breakdown after repressing a wartime trauma he couldn't bring himself to face. Klinger choosing to stay in Korea with his new wife Soon Lee, rather than return to Toledo. Father Mulcahy losing much of his hearing from a nearby explosion, and facing a future where his calling would be harder to fulfill. Margaret left for a new assignment. BJ rode off on a motorcycle without saying goodbye, then came back to say it. The Korean War ended. The 4077th disbanded. Everyone scattered in different directions, back to lives the show had never shown the audience. The outdoor set in the hills near Malibu, California, where the exterior scenes had been filmed for 11 years, had already been partially destroyed by a brush fire in October 1982. The writers incorporated it into the finale. The fire in the script is caused by enemy bombs forcing the 4077th to evacuate. What the cameras captured was, in part, an actual burned landscape. The show's physical home was gone. They filmed it the way it was, and that truthfulness is visible on screen. The final image of the episode, Hawkeye looking down from a helicopter at the word goodbye, spelled out in stones on the ground by BJ, has been seen by more people in a single broadcast than almost any other image in television history. That is a strange and enormous thing to sit with.
Klinger, start swimming. Aye, aye, sir.
What happened next, and why it mattered. CBS was not ready to let MASH go. 3 spin-offs followed, none of them captured what the original had. The most significant, and most disastrous, was After MASH, which premiered in September 1983, just 6 months after the finale. It brought back Harry Morgan as Colonel Potter, Jamie Farr as Klinger, and William Christopher as Father Mulcahy, now working together in a veterans hospital in Missouri after the war. Larry Gelbart, who had left the original series after season 4, returned to write the pilot and ended up staying much longer than he intended. After MASH actually ranked in the top 20 during its first season and even earned Gelbart a Peabody Award for one episode. But it was inconsistent. CBS made meddlesome changes between seasons, recasting Mildred Potter, the Colonel's beloved wife, with a different actress and a thinner characterization, and reversing story conclusions from the original finale that had given the characters genuine closure. In its second season, the network made the decision to place it directly against the A-Team on NBC, by then one of the biggest shows on American television. The ratings collapsed almost immediately. After MASH was canceled mid-season. Its final produced episode, Wet Feet, never aired in the United States. CBS replaced it with a news special about tax reform. That may be the most ignoble ending in television history. The pilot Walter, made in 1984, reimagined the sweet, wide-eyed Radar O'Reilly as a rookie police officer in St. Louis, whose farm had failed and who was described in scripts as suicidal. It was never purchased by any network. The version of that character that 106 million people had watched leave camp on the back of a Jeep deserved better than that particular follow-up. Trapper John, MD, ran from 1979 to 1986, actually overlapping with the original series for 4 years. But its producers had successfully argued in court that it was derived from the 1970 Altman film rather than the television show. So legally, it wasn't a MASH spin-off at all, even though every viewer knew exactly where Trapper John came from. After MASH failed, CBS left the property alone. A docudrama project called Mashback was briefly announced in 2003, with Larry Gelbart giving it his blessing, but it never went into production and disappeared without comment. Nobody has attempted a reboot. Nobody has tried a revival. Given what happened to MASH, that restraint has been entirely correct.
Sorry about that, sir.
That's disgusting. Sound to me, that's a tiptoe through the tulip.
The slow fading. Here is where the story gets more complicated and more honest. MASH did not suddenly vanish. For decades after its finale, it ran in syndication across hundreds of television stations. People who had never seen it during its original run encountered it in reruns. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, it remained one of the most watched shows in syndication. TV Land, Nick at Night, and various local stations kept it cycling through American living rooms well into the 2000s. But syndication schedules changed. Cable television expanded and fragmented audiences across dozens of channels. The shows that younger generations discovered during the 1990s and 2000s were different ones, and those shows eventually became the cultural touchstones that their generation used as reference points. MASH, set during a war that had itself been called the Forgotten War, began to slip from the active cultural conversation. Alan Alda remained a public figure. His work continued. His voice continued to be heard. But the ensemble of faces that had defined the show for 11 years was dispersing. Several of the cast members who had been the faces of the show for a generation were gone. McLean Stevenson died in January 1996. Larry Linville died in April 2000. Harry Morgan died in December 2011. Wayne Rogers died in December 2015. William Christopher died in December 2016. David Ogden Stiers died in March 2018. With each passing, the show lost another living connection to the people who had made it real for a generation. The Korean War itself had always been the invisible obstacle. It was bracketed, in American memory, between World War II and Vietnam, two conflicts that generated enormous cultural output: films, books, monuments, anniversaries. The Korean War generated comparatively little. It ended in an armistice rather than a victory. It was called the Forgotten War before MASH came along to give it a kind of pop culture afterlife. When that afterlife faded, the war retreated back into its corner of the historical memory. Streaming changed everything again, but perhaps not in the direction you might hope. When MASH became available on streaming platforms, it found an audience, but a smaller one than its syndication heyday had reached. A 256-episode series set during the Korean War, written with the social politics of the 1970s baked into every storyline, is not the easiest sell to a viewer who grew up on streaming television's faster rhythms and shorter episode formats. Some episodes aged differently than others. The humor of the early seasons, particularly around gender and race, reflected the attitudes and blind spots of the 1970s, rather than the 1950s setting. That created a layer of friction that hadn't existed when the show was new. The later seasons, which leaned harder into drama and character study, held up more consistently. But getting to them required patience that modern viewing habits don't always allow. Alan Alda has said in interviews that MASH worked because it was honest about what war did to people, not just physically, but psychologically, and that honesty was as uncomfortable in 1972 as it sometimes is now. The show asked its audience to hold comedy and grief in the same hand at the same time. That's a harder ask than it sounds. Not every generation finds its way to it.
You always losing your keys?
Yeah.
Well, this is a keychain and the cartridge is a fob.
What Remains? What Remains is a record that nobody has broken. The finale of MASH is still the most watched scripted episode in American television history. Not the Seinfeld finale, not The Sopranos, not Breaking Bad, not any episode from the era of prestige cable television that critics spent a decade celebrating as the golden age of the medium. Nothing from any streaming platform. A 1983 farewell to a show set during the Korean War, on a broadcast network with no recording option for most of its audience, drew more viewers in a single night than anything that has come before or since. Alan Alda is still alive and working. Loretta Swit, Jamie Farr, Mike Farrell, and Gary Berghoff are still alive. The show won 14 Emmy Awards over its run and received a Peabody Award in 1975. The operating room set from MASH was preserved and put on display at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution in 1983. An unusual honor for a television prop, and a recognition that the show had meant something beyond entertainment. There is also the Malibu Creek State Park, where the exterior filming locations still exist. A replica of the famous road sign, the one pointing to various cities with their mileage, with Toledo always pointing the way home for Klinger, was installed on the site in 2008. People still make the drive out to see it. The burned-out shell of a military ambulance used in filming is still there. The show has been off the air for over 40 years, and people are still hiking into the hills outside Los Angeles to stand in the place where it was made. And yet, for most people under 40, MASH is a name they recognize, but a show they've never actually sat down and watched. It occupies a strange space in the culture. Too important to be dismissed, not visible enough to be current. The generation that grew up with it is now in their 60s and 70s. The generation that came after it had other shows. The generation after that had streaming. MASH ran for 11 seasons. It covered, in fictional form, a war that lasted 3 years, meaning each episode represented roughly 4.5 days of real time. It lasted 3 times as long as the conflict it depicted. It ended with a broadcast that 106 million people watched in a single night. And somewhere between that night and now, slowly, and without any dramatic announcement, it began to disappear from the active conversation that the culture has with itself about what matters. Not because it stopped being good, because time moved on and didn't look back. There's a particular kind of sadness that belongs to things that were once enormous and are now half-remembered. MASH earned every bit of the audience it had. 11 seasons, 256 episodes, 14 Emmys, a Peabody, a Smithsonian exhibit, the most watched finale in the history of scripted television, a show that the Library of Congress could have placed in its National Film Registry without anyone arguing. The people who watched it know exactly what it meant to sit down on a Tuesday night and let Hawkeye Pierce make you laugh and break your heart in the same half hour. That experience was real, and it mattered, and it shaped how a generation understood what television was capable of. If you were one of those people, you already know all of this. If you weren't, the show is still there. All 256 episodes. The operating room without the laugh track. The hills of Malibu standing in for Korea. The last page of a script handed to actors who didn't know what it said. It didn't go anywhere. It's just waiting for someone to find it again. If this video brought something back for you, hit the like button. And subscribe if you want more stories about the television, music, and culture that shaped a generation and deserve to be remembered.